A huge thank you to all the super sponsors who make it possible for me to make these videos. Visit David X Newton on Patreon to join the ASCII Brigade. Doing the comparison videos for Prince of Persia taught me to anticipate that among these videos there would be one port that decided to go completely rogue and do everything differently. The Super Nintendo version of Prince was unique in extending the base game in every direction possible, adding new environments, bosses and billions of other things. Once again, Nintendo takes the title of most unport-like port here in the form of Doom 64, which was handled by Midway Games and was released in 1997. Unlike the Saturn port, which came out just 5 days earlier, Midway had identified that the window in which they could capitalise on making yet another straight port of Doom had already come and gone. The 4 years since Doom's release was an eternity at the pace that games technology was moving in the 90s, and by 1997 PC players were already eagerly anticipating the release of Quake 2. Therefore, for their Nintendo 64 version of Doom, they took the core of the engine from the PlayStation port, added their own features to it, threw out all the existing graphics and levels and replaced them with completely new ones. Doom 64 then is not just a console port in the same way that all the others are, but an entirely separate game whose backstory is presented as a sequel to Doom 2. Years after the demonic invasion of Earth, the UAC installations have been sealed off and quarantined under a massive dose of radiation, and Doomguy is the subject of medical studies as he suffers post-traumatic nightmares about his experience. Suddenly, something awakens in the abandoned bases, bringing the irradiated demons back to life, and on the strength of Doomguy's previous experience, someone decides to drag him out of hospital, stuff him into a uniform, give him a small pistol, and shove him into the midst of the hellish invasion again. The unique triple-pronged Nintendo 64 controller, which frankly I've always found a bit of a mess, means that this version uses a rather different control scheme from everything else, and I'm still not exactly sure how you're supposed to play it. Either the analog stick or the D-pad can be used for movement, but the fire button is on Z, which is placed underneath the controller opposite the analog stick, so the usefulness of the D-pad is quite limited. A and B, which are usually important triggers in games, are demoted to cycling through weapons. Next to them, the 4 smaller C buttons get the usual face button jobs of run, open, strafe on and toggling the map. Dedicated strafe controls are on the shoulder buttons, so depending on your hand position you have a choice between either being able to fire or strafe left or growing an extra arm. Thankfully, the game allows these to be remapped quite thoroughly in the options menu. A generous number of defaults are provided to suit different preferences, and all of them are fully customizable so you can set things up to your liking. I use a PlayStation 2 controller on my PC, so it took a bit of imagination, but I was able to work out how to get it to suit me eventually. It's actually possible to make things work like modern double analog stick controls by assigning movement and strafing to the D-pad and turning to the C buttons, but I didn't find this very comfortable and eventually remapped it all to resemble the PlayStation version instead, with the actions on the face buttons. Once you've worked out how to control the game, you'll be able to make your way through the new campaign, which takes place across 32 exclusive levels, comprising 25 regular and 7 secret ones. The appearance of the game is very unlike any of the others, and visually this is the darkest Doom yet. Partially it's reported because everyone involved in it preferred to code in pitch darkness and forgot to check what it looked like in a room with a normal amount of lighting. But even with the brightness turned up, the atmosphere is heavy and oppressive. It uses the same new library of sounds as on the PlayStation, and Aubrey Hodges provided another evil-laced soundtrack using a combination of bassy synthesizers, distorted metallic noises, and the tormented souls of the eternally damned. The coloured lighting that appeared on the PlayStation is used all over the place here, giving the game more variety in its environments than its small texture set otherwise would, and making sure that your enemies can blend in and attack from the shadows. The monsters have also been given a major overhaul. They're mostly the same ones as in the original game mechanically, but they've all been redrawn to be larger and more menacing to suit the idea of new demon mutations. They were created as clay models by Gregor Punchatz, who was the artist who had made the monster models for Doom 2, and were pulled through a process of translating the physical objects into digital 3D models before rendering the sprites out from those. The new bestiary consists of most of the monsters from the original game, but excludes the most annoying ones, those being the Chain Gunner, Revenant, Arch-Violent Spider Mastermind. But it does include a brand new boss monster, the Mother Demon, who you'll encounter at the end of the game and is a powerhouse of flame and homing missile attacks. Occasionally, the new looks of the existing monsters come with new mechanics as well. The Doom 64 Arachnotron fires double plasma bolts, and the Pain Elemental, which is the ugliest thing I've ever seen, is also now twice as irritating due to its 2 mouths with which it spits out lost souls to nibble and harass you. And like the PlayStation had its Nightmare Spectres, the N64 has Nightmare Imps, which move and fire twice as quickly. The first third of the game takes place in the UAC bases, and then you dive back into hell with an arena map modelled on Dead Simple before fighting your way through a series of hellish castles. The new levels are on the compact side compared to the massive Doom 2 cityscapes to suit the lower memory limits of a console environment, and a lot of them have a boxy element to them without a lot of non-orthogonal lines. Compared to Doom 1, there also seems to be more of an emphasis on finding switches hidden around corners and on little pillars and then trying to work out what they did, which can result in going round in circles a little longer than necessary between monster encounters. Nevertheless, the new maps don't feel uninteresting. I found that they each had a character of their own, and that even when I got stuck, they were the right size and length to feel satisfying without having to linger on one map for too long. The addition of a scripting system called Macros allows this version to show off more complex sequences with lights, teleports and moving floors and ceilings than the other versions did. An early example is this terraformer in the second level, which terraforms the ground by repeatedly battering it with 4 gigantic hammers. In places, vertical sector movement is even used to create the illusion of rooms crossing above and below each other by shifting things around while the player isn't looking. And unlike all the other console versions so far, Doom 64 is very enthusiastic about using physical traps, with an inconvenient array of crushers, missile turrets and Quake-style dart shooters joining the usual hazards. All of these usually work very well, but occasionally I found myself being tripped up by an action being assigned to picking up a weapon. If you already have full ammunition, this means you won't be able to trigger the next part of the level and you'll be running around stuck until you think to waste some bullets. Among all the impressive mechanics, this seems like a surprisingly amateurish mistake. Continuing in its innovation, Doom 64 is also the only port to feature a new weapon. It doesn't actually have a name and is referred to only as the "what the f*** is this" when you pick it up, but Doom fans have taken to calling it the Unmaker due to its resemblance to a weapon described in Tom Hall's design document The Doom Bible. When you first encounter it, you'd be forgiven for finding it slightly underwhelming. It's a hellish skeletal laser gun that uses cells to fire small red beams that can deal a highly variable 10 to 80 points of damage like a Revenant missile. However, in a feature unique to this weapon, it can be upgraded by finding the demonic orange, purple and cyan keys in the secret levels throughout the game. Collecting these will gradually upgrade the firing rate of the Unmaker until you're firing 3 simultaneous beams every 4 game ticks for a damage output of about 1,000 points per second. Having a fully assembled Unmaker greatly increases your chances against the Mother Demon and her monstrous horde at the end of the game, making the whole thing a sort of game-wide hidden side quest for the first time in Doom. Even though this game can no longer sanely be described as just a port, I'm glad that putting these videos together made me finally have a proper try at Doom 64. Going in a different direction from the original Doom was definitely the right move in 1997, and it gave us a new game that still felt like it had the DNA of Doom at a time when it was being eclipsed by the new shiny technology of the Quake series. It worked well enough that many people in the community think of Doom 64 as the real third Doom game. At the time it had a limited audience due to its Nintendo exclusivity, but since then there have been multiple efforts to bring it to more people, most of them led by longtime Doom community member Samuel Villarreal, known online as Kaiser. Doom 64 Absolution was his first attempt in 2003, taking assets from the Nintendo 64 game and putting them into the Doomsday Engine source port. Several years later, in 2008, he followed this up with Doom 64 EX, which was a source port of its own that re-implemented the engine that was used to run Doom 64. This release included a tool that was used to convert data from the actual Nintendo 64 cartridge into an iWAD file to run on the source port. In 2020, Kaiser also headed an official re-release of the game with Night Dive Studios, which is available on Steam and consoles. As part of the release, he designed a new episode called The Lost Levels. In this one, a new threat has to be defeated in the form of the sister of the Mother Demon, presumably the Antichrist, and it features slightly larger and more elaborate maps suited for the excesses of modern consoles. It also adds some niceties like mid-level saves, support for widescreen televisions and raising the frame rate, and I found it the most comfortable way to play the game. If you haven't played it yet, it's certainly worth it to get a whole new and slightly different Doom experience. After 1997, the Doom console porting industry died down as players moved on to later games. But a couple of years later, at the turn of the millennium, handheld game devices were beginning to make some significant leaps, and games that had previously been bound to televisions and monitors were now being given new leases of life in portable form. So, a few months after the release of Nintendo's new generation handheld in 2001, the Jaguar source code was dug up one more time to bring Doom to the Game Boy Advance. The GBA port was developed by David A. Palmer Productions, who had previously approached id Software with a frankly insane tech demo of a port for the Game Boy Color. id asked them if they could make a Commander Keen game for the Game Boy Color instead, and so the Doom port was pushed back and retargeted to the Advance. And it seemed to work out very well. The game has some slowdown in levels with large open areas, but overall it runs incredibly well for such a small device. A lot of this may be due to not having to worry about supporting a massive screen size with doubled horizontal width and a resolution of just 240 by 160, but on a small screen it works well enough and it easily outpaces many of the full-size consoles like the 3DO and Saturn. In stark contrast to the Nintendo 64 version, you'll immediately notice that this version is much brighter than all the others. For all its advancedness, the Game Boy Advance's screen did not come equipped with a backlight, complicating the act of actually seeing the games you were playing. So many games for the system exaggerated their colours to make up for it and appear fairly garish when not played on the original hardware. The lighting is higher in general, walls don't get more faded as they get further away from you, and some items, like the brown boxes of bullets, have been turned a more noticeable shade of green instead. If all of that isn't enough, the game also provides the option to switch to what it calls static lighting, which is like wearing light amplification goggles all the time. Another graphical difference comes from Nintendo being very keen to avoid mature-rated games on their handhelds. All the blood in the game has been turned green, which seemed to be a common quick fix for toning down violence in the late 90s. I remember that for my standard grade English exam I wrote about violence in games, and mentioned how absurd it was that we consider pixels with this RGB value much more offensive than pixels with this RGB value. Needless to say, I was a tremendously boring child. Undoubtedly related to the greenification issue, absolutely no enemies in this version will explode into a pile of fleshy bits, not even under the influence of a direct hit with high explosives. I imagine that not having to keep those sprites in memory was quite welcome from a performance standpoint as well. The N64 version had offered save slots alongside passwords between levels, and this version only supports saves. Between every level you'll be prompted to save your game and you'll be able to pick it back up from the main menu later. And breaking from the usual pattern for console difficulty levels, the Game Boy Advance eschews the ultra-violence setting, with the difficulty above Hurt Me Plenty being Nightmare. However, like the other console ports, this setting doesn't give monsters any respawning abilities or even enhanced speed or aggressiveness, and it is functionally just ultra-violence. I imagine that cutting out the word violence was also an element of keeping the game's age rating down, but it erases the reference to A Clockwork Orange so the game becomes much less highbrow and literary. Just about everything else from the Jaguar version is preserved here, although you'll notice a couple of sounds that are performing double duty to reduce the number of audio samples the game has to keep track of. Most annoyingly, the oof sound that Doom Guy normally makes when landing from a tall drop has been replaced with a pain noise, which can fool you into thinking you're being damaged from somewhere unseen. Unlike certain other ports, the tracked music has been reconstructed to suit the GBA's sound hardware, and the result is a collection of interesting chiptune versions of the original music, although a lot of the tracks have been swapped around between levels for no apparent reason. The GBA has quite a severely limited palette of inputs and has to cram the controls onto just A and B along with 2 shoulder buttons. With that in mind, it's surprising that the game actually feels fairly comfortable. By default, the open and run controls share the B button this time, leaving attack on the A button and strafing on L and R. Select toggles the auto map, start as the options menu, and no space is wasted on redundant controls. Choosing weapons is done by holding down both shoulder buttons and pressing up and down on the D-pad, meaning the player doesn't have to move their fingers away from their usual positions to do it. I think all of this works very well, especially considering the limited space, but if for any reason it doesn't for you, there are also 5 other control schemes available to try. So despite this version having to be so compact in many ways, it's really a pretty competent edition of the original game. Finally, a unique selling point of this port is the inclusion of maps 25 to 32, which are called DM1 to DM8. These are deathmatch-only levels that are made available when playing via the GBA's link cable, and it makes them the only multiplayer-specific levels released in any official version of Doom. The first one noticeably resembles the 4th Quake deathmatch level, The Bad Place, but at the time of writing this, nobody seems to know who actually made these levels. There's a list of level designers from id credited in the manual, including Tim Willits, and with his famous affinity for multiplayer-only maps, it's possible that he might have encouraged their inclusion. The last port that I'll be looking at wasn't a standalone release, but a bonus attached to the collector's edition of Doom 3 released on the original Xbox in 2005. And it's also the most difficult one to find specific information about on Google due to the annoyance of people having reused both the names Doom and Xbox One for more recent things. I really would like people to stop doing this. The 90s Doom content is available from the Collector's Edition's main menu by going into Extras and selecting Classic Doom, and this gives you the option to play either the Ultimate Doom or Doom 2. And just by looking at them, you can tell why looking at ports beyond this one is pretty uninteresting. We've reached a point where I'm really just showing you the original game. This copy has its roots in the DOS version, but actually came through an intermediate source port called Linux Doom, which Dave Taylor had written shortly after the release of Doom 2. This copy of Doom doesn't have any of the cuts or rearrangements of the other ports, and all levels, monsters, weapons, cyberdemons, spider masterminds and other details are present. Even the Icon of Sin finally gets to have his first appearance on the console version. This is the first official port of Doom to default to what you might call a modern control scheme. The arrival of dual analog sticks in 1997 had led console first-person shooter controls towards using one stick for movement and the other for turning, negating the need for any strafe buttons. As a result, the Xbox seems to be flagrantly showing off just how many buttons it can now afford to waste. Up on the directional pad is used to toggle the map, and the black and white buttons below the face buttons are used exclusively to zoom it in and out. The A button gets the previously underappreciated job of viewing the last displayed message. The left and right shoulder buttons completely unnecessarily alter the screen size. Thumbing its nose at the pre-millennium consoles with their 1 or 2 weapon cycle buttons, the Xbox provides 4. The back and start buttons both call up the same in-game menu, and after including all of this bloat, it still has room for fire on the right trigger, run on the left and open on the X button. This still leaves 3 possible triggers unused. The pressable thumbsticks and down direction are left to take a break. Even though the game contains everything the DOS version did, there are a couple of interesting oddities in the sound department to talk about. If you've played Doom as much as I have, you'll have a nagging sensation that something is slightly wrong with the music. It's nowhere near the flatulent abomination that the 32X gave us, but it just plays very slightly slower than on DOS. During Entryway, this not quite right rendition of Running from Evil gave me uneasy flashbacks for reasons that I trust will be obvious. Another audio strangeness is that the game's sound effects have a random upward alteration to their pitch applied each time they're played. This means the monsters don't make exactly the same sounds every time, but the effect is tuned to be just a little too noticeable for my taste, and it sounds like the samples are being played incorrectly. This feature actually existed in versions of DOS Doom as well up until 1.4 in mid-1994, when a change to the DMX sound library made the way they were doing the pitch alteration no longer work, and nobody liked it enough to bother re-implementing it. The Linux Doom port fixes the bug and the effect is carried through to the Xbox. I also have to mention the cheat codes. These have been part of every console version so far, with all of them at least having codes for God mode and all weapons, but I'm bringing them up here because on the Xbox they're going to be part of your gameplay experience whether you want them to be or not. They're all performed by holding down the run button and pressing a sequence of just 4 face buttons in succession, and they're very easy to activate accidentally. Holding run and frantically tapping the use button is a common situation in hectic levels, so you'll find yourself suddenly invincible without meaning to be. There are a couple of extras over the original game, the first of which is that it's the first console version of Doom to provide support for split-screen multiplayer. This is an arrangement that will be familiar to those of us who grew up in the 90s, before it was so easy to link things together via the internet, where you would instead crowd around your 17-inch television and play the game in a window the size of a stamp. Cooperative and deathmatch player both supported, and it runs very well, with up to 4 players sharing the screen. And you don't get additional space if you don't have all 4 players, you're confined to a quarter of the screen no matter what. The other matter is the addition of 2 levels, one each to Dooms 1 and 2. This isn't as big a deal as you might think, because they're not actually new official ones, they're both maps that were originally made in the mid-90s by members of the Doom 3 programming team. The entrances to them don't involve any clever alterations to the layout of the familiar levels, they're just tucked away on pressable line defs where no sane person would think to look for them. Sewers is the first of the new levels and is accessed by pressing on an unremarkable wall in the corner of E1M1's central courtyard. It was made by David Calvin, who was the lead programmer of the Doom 3 port, and it was originally released in 1994. It's a fairly sparse set of angular water-filled tunnels leading to a courtyard where you need the yellow key to escape. The other new level is called Betray and is map 33 of Doom 2. It's accessed from underhalls by interacting with a wall at the back of one of the monster chambers that opens when you pick up the red key. This one was made by another Xbox Doom 3 programmer, Michael Bukowski, in 1995, and is equally sewer-like, consisting of a confusing underground teleporter maze followed by a large arena. Both the maps are fairly crude, obviously having been made at a time when tools for making Doom levels were very primitive, and they don't fit in at all with the regular levels. So even though they're hidden away, opinion is a bit divided here as to whether it might have been a bit tacky to add early personal levels into an official port. The Xbox version of Doom was representative of another turning point in the games industry. After a series of very different takes on the game to suit the different environments of the early 90s, the architecture of PCs and consoles were now similar enough that the difference between playing a game on one system or another was getting to be comparatively insignificant. At this stage in the other port comparison videos I've done, I've drawn up a list ranking the versions from worst to best, but I never did this with any great deal of sincerity, and I'm not going to do it at all here. It's true that some console ports are markedly more playable than others, but all of them have interesting stories behind them and made efforts in their own way to recreate and sometimes extend the original game. I have not, of course, covered all the ports of Doom in these videos. Nowadays it's become a running joke to get Doom running on anything that has an input device and some semblance of a screen, and there's an unfathomable number of custom-made editions and source ports for all sorts of unlikely hardware. Many of these derive from the same Linux Doom code that powered the Xbox port, and through them many people expanded the capabilities of Doom in multiple directions since its release 30 years ago. These days, the Doom property is owned by Bethesda Softworks, and their official current release of Doom is called the Doom Classic Unity port, which runs across many computer, console and mobile formats. While it isn't my favourite choice for actually playing the game, something they've really got right with it is in embracing the community of creators that has been building for the last 30 years. New community-led contributions, such as widescreen graphics and dehacked support, have been added to the port since its release in 2019, and it supports a growing list of notable level packs termed add-ons. These include the final Doom WODs released in 1996 through famous WODs of the 2000s to modern creations including John Romero's Sigil series. Even so many years after the 90s ports, it's good to see both the classic Doom games and their community creations are still being brought to the console audience. Thanks once more to everyone listed here for sponsoring my videos. If you'd like to join the Discord or have some ideas for future games to cover, please look at David X Newton on Patreon.